So if we're going to look at pandas inside of Python, we're going to load NumPy, pandas, and matplotlib. And again, it's just a library, and it's going to be PD is how we're going to access pandas. These three commands set up the display so you can, the data set we're going to read in is wide, so just widens the screen so we can see the whole thing. The dataset we're going to work with is called the Titanic dataset. It's a very common introductory dataset for data science. It's free to access and gives all the information about the passengers on the Titanics. We're going to look at the head, which is the first 5 records of the data set, and then we're going to describe the data set, which is going to give us some simple descriptive statistics about it. So there we go. We read it in, and there's the first 5 records. So you can see we have the class of their ticket, whether they survived as a 0 and 1, name, sex, age, and then a whole bunch of information about how much they paid, what ticket number they were, how much they paid, what their cabin was, and that sort of thing. If we look at the descriptive statistics, we can see we get count, the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum, and then the quartiles down at the bottom. And what we want to look at is survived here, and the mean survival rate is listed as 38 here, 0.38, and as you can see, if we run the next one, we can. Now all we're doing is the exact same thing, but now we're removing some of the columns that we aren't really worried about. It makes it a little easier to read. So we can get rid of columns to look at. If we look at pandas 4, again, we're going to do the same thing. Let's just get rid of those describe and head up there. We don't need to see that. We'll just do the head after we drop those columns. If we run that, you can see here we have, after we drop those columns, it's easier to read. And again, we have the mean survival rate was 38%, which means 38% of the passengers survived. And if we look at the count of the passengers, we look at the third class, the first class, and the second class passengers. And the question we want to look at is, supposedly during this time period, the goal would be women and children first in the evacuation mode. So let's take a look at that. If we look at number 5, we can see 38% survived. And we do that just because we have the survival count, which is 0 and 1s. And if you do a mean of 0 and 1s, you get yes or no's. You get the survival rate. If we look at Panda 6, now we start looking at it, breaking it up by gender. So now we have survived, 72% of the women survived, and only 20% of the men survived. If we start looking at that same information based on their ticket class, we can say 96% of the women in first class survived, 88% of the women in second class survived, and 49% of the women in third class survived. And then we look at the men, we say only 34% of the men in first class survived, 14% of the men in second class survived, and 15% of the men in third class survived. So one of the things you might think of or have thought about the Titanic was that there were a lot of first class men who, there's stories of them dressing up in women's clothes to sneak off the ship and things. But as you can see, while first class men passengers had a better survival rate than second and third class, it still is much lower than even the third class women's survival rate. So it does look like at least the women were getting off before the men. And let's look at class a little bit further. Now let's look at, if we look at these, we did the same thing here, but now we're looking at people under 18. So now 80% of the women who were in first class survived, which is actually less than all the women in first class if we look at there. 100% of the women who were under 18 survived in second class, and 54%. And so clearly, it does look like that younger people were given priority to survive, or they were just stronger and could survive being dunked into icy cold water. And the same thing with the men. We have 34% of first class men survived overall, but 85% of first class men who were under 18 survived. And 73% of women in second class survived, and as opposed to only, so that was less than the 88% there. But if we do 73% of the men, and that's much higher than the 14% of the men. So clearly, that men under 18 had a much better survival rate than men who were over 18. Now the thing is, was 18, when the Titanic was sailing, a good disembarking point for children? Let's move that to 16 and see what we get. If we look at 16, so we have under 18 and under 16, those numbers pop up even more. So you have a 91% chance of being a man in second class and surviving. Again, third class is still better, but still 30% is still not good. But you can see that 16 is probably a better indication of being a child when the Titanic was sailing than it is today. If we look even further, we can start saying going all the way down to 13. So now we're also got to think about, we have to look at the counts. So we have one person who didn't survive, who was a first class woman under the age of 13. Well, she was 2 years old. So it doesn't mean that she wasn't in a boat or didn't get a chance, but a 2-year-old in an open boat on the freezing weather may have gotten sick and died no matter what happened. And so we have to look at the counts and not just the averages when we start looking at this data to make these decisions. And if we go all the way to 10, we can look at, we try and remove some of the very young people. So I have between 4 and 11 on there. And the survival rate is, if you were between the age of 4 and 11 and you were a woman, and there were no first class women, second class in that age group, 100%, 50% in third class, 100% of the men, 100% of the women, 100% of the men in first and second class, and 31% of the men in third class. And as you can see, the counts were very small there. It's only 3 and 4, so these 100% should be taken with a grain of salt. And so that gives you an idea of what you can do in Pandas. And in fact, if you're interested in doing that, if you take the Python 2 class, we spend about half the course learning all the things you can do with Pandas. Well, some of the things you can do with Pandas.